Well, welcome back to the Cyber Talent Matrix Live. We're so glad you're here. For those of you joining us for the first time, this show is about exploring the people side of cybersecurity, the roles, the skills, and the strategies that organizations need to build resilient teams. I'm Jeff Welgan, joined by my co-hosts Sasha Vanterpool and Will Denman. In today's episode, we're diving into one of the trickiest but most important parts of cyber workforce strategy, frameworks and taxonomies. You've probably heard acronyms like NIST NICE, DCWF, SFIA, ENISA's ECSF, and wondered how do they fit together? Do they overlap? Do they compete? And why do sometimes they feel like they're speaking different languages? So that's what we're unpacking today. The good, the bad, the ugly of frameworks, and how to manage a Rosetta Stone that helps make sense of them all. So welcome, everybody. Welcome, Will. Welcome back. Sasha, how are you guys doing today?
Good, Jeff. Thanks. How about you?
Doing great.
Okay. I've got this coffee. I've got this coffee and this coffee. So I think we're ready to go.
Nice.
We got to power through. It's a busy day. So let's get right into it with frameworks. I think the first part of our show today, we're really going to just kind of frame up the frameworks a bit, and then talk a little bit about the pros and cons, or the good, bad, and ugly. So with that, Sasha, I'd love to kind of turn it over to you. I mentioned a few frameworks at the beginning here. I think those are probably what we're going to talk about most today. But can you kind of contextualize just a little bit of what we're talking about when we say cyber workforce frameworks and all these different ones that I just kind of vomited on the mic?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lot of acronyms and it can be a little overwhelming, but I think just even workforce frameworks can be overwhelming because it tends to sound really academic and you're kind of just like, well, frameworks, like, what are you even talking about here? And I think like how we can think about it is more like if you ever wondered how we decide like what a SOC analyst should do, or how a CISO role compares across different industries, or why certifications seem to matter so much in defense contracting. Frameworks are really the blueprint behind it all. And like you mentioned, Jeff, there's several major players in this space. I think the most common one in the US is the NIST NICE framework. And that really kind of serves as a common language. It defines different categories, work roles, and the skills that people working in cybersecurity need. When it comes to defense, the DoD Cyber Workforce Framework, that is really kind of more tied to those federal military kind of roles. It's really kind of directly towards missions and certifications. And so that it tends to be a little bit more focused on the government side of the house. But then we have like globally the SFIA or the SFIA framework. That one's used more generally in the sense that it's not just cyber specific. It definitely encompasses more of the like IT and just information security. Exactly. And definitely does provide a little bit more because it goes across mapping skills and seniority levels, which those two other frameworks don't really do the same way. And then Europe has its own one that really does harmonize roles across its member states. And then even continuing to go the national or international level, there's specific countries like Saudi Arabia and Australia that have specific frameworks that really adapt to its local and individual needs of those countries. And then you have some that are specific to industry groups, like the Linux Foundation are really trying to make frameworks that are more practical, specifically for employers. And then you have, MITRE ATT&CK and DEFEND, which aren't workforce frameworks, but those are more of a global reference for adversary tactics and defense techniques. So I think, we're going to be focusing more on like the workforce frameworks, as that's kind of our specialty with workforce intelligence in the cyber world, but knowing that there are those other, specific cybersecurity.
I'm glad you mentioned the MITRE ones too, because, you're right. They're not cyber workforce frameworks, but what we see a lot of times is they're often used to kind of connect workforce frameworks to, especially things like training, right? Labs or certifications. They'll use that as an intermediary framework to kind of help make sense of a workforce framework to specific skills they're trying to train people on to, defend against adversarial action. So
I think that's a really great point. I think in general, these workforce workforce frameworks, it's quite a mouthful, tend to, that's the purpose that they're serving. They really kind of influence how we hire and train, how you want to try and benchmark skills, and how organizations can prove compliance. So that's kind of what we're going to really kind of talk about in detail, just kind of giving you that high overview there. But of course, we can get into the details of it, but I think, for the sake of time and things like that, we'll kind of just go over them at an overview level. And I think, at SkillRex, what we try and do is really we understand certain industries or certain organizations, they kind of maybe are a little bit more aligned to one or another. Some aren't using them at all. Some are trying to get a little bit of each of them. And I think that's what we try and do as well, is kind of really look at these frameworks side by side and how we can try and translate across them and make them usable for real people and organizations that are actually doing the work and what makes the most sense for their business needs in their industry.
Yeah. I think one of the good things to maybe start off too, and I really appreciate you contextualizing the workforce frameworks for everyone. I think one of the things that's really challenging for any organization that is putting together some sort of framework or skills framework. I know we're going to talk about taxonomies more in a little bit as well, but I think it's really challenging because this particular profession, the cyber or information security or IT, it does move fast. So, while I think they try to keep things as usable, I want to say as broad or evergreen as possible, I think there's challenges in doing that, right? Because you have specificity towards certain types of skills, but then also how do you design a framework in a way that is usable? So we've seen, all the frameworks go through their own iterations regularly, a challenge for anybody using framework. But NICE, we'll talk about NICE real quick, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education under NIST. Every time they have an update, it can kind of throw things off. And what they're trying to do is not, I'm speculating a little bit, not overwhelming users with constant changes, but having effective, meaningful updates when updates are necessary. So you'll see them happen once every year or a couple of years. And I think what's hard is trying to keep things as fresh as the workforce requires, while not overwhelming users of the framework. So it's really hard when stuff is new. AI is not new, right? But it really hit the scene hot a couple of years ago. So catching up to how should we think about artificial intelligence and the things relating to that from a skills or a competency or a knowledge area or a task area is kind of where a lot of the challenges lie for any framework organization. So I think that's a little piece of context that's really important for everybody, watching or listening to the show today, is that, we're going to critique some things, but we understand also the challenges of managing a framework really well, and don't envy the people who have to do that hard work. It's a lot of hard work, and we respect that. So, Will, I don't know if you're kind of a different view of workforce frameworks from Sasha and I, who kind of use it on the, I would say, the more the front end. You're looking at a lot of the workforce stuff on the back end. Before we kind of dive right in on maybe some of the good, the bad, and the ugly, I just want to see if you had anything to add to help.
Well, it's very much like, no, it's very much like the good and the bad and the ugly are very much wrapped into just it conceptually, right? So it all comes down to a need for a standardized, naming convention or something like that, right? What skills do you need to track, and how do you need to track them, and things like that? And you're always balancing things like relevancy and different, maybe, some people, they go into work rules or something like that as kind of the main clustering kind of grouping of things. But so you could kind of silo it by focus or something like that. But again, with all of these, you're essentially doing this weird balancing game between so many different factors. And for a lot of people, it's like, if you have more cookie cutter sort of what do you have it like roles or something, right? Then it might be a lot easier to conform to particular frameworks. But if you are a super large organization with incredibly specialized, individuals, like that's going to have an impact on how you grade and judge, right?
For sure.
What is the experience curve look like for all these, right? Because I
Yeah.
think another one, and it's kind of going to be a thing, when I talk about like the thing I learned and whatnot this week, is talking about how do we look at maintaining relevancy with these skills, right?
Mm.
Or I guess you should say like adjusting
Mm.
relevancy for these skills. And then on top of that, how does experience and things play into it, right? And the different types of experience.
Yeah.
So stuff like that that's really what we look at on the back end, because if we're trying to put these down into numbers and things, right,
Mhm.
these can be fairly subjective categories. But at the same time, you could go on a standard like 0 to 100 grading scale, but you're going to see that it's more difficult to go from maybe a intermediate kind of knowledge sort of person to an expert, right? That's going to be way harder than going from a novice to an intermediate, and that's something you have to track, right? And then how do you
And most
categorize it? How do
frameworks
you
don't, with the exception of maybe SFIA, that kind
Yeah.
of has a proficiency level piece to it,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I
And
almost feel
so
like every single pro of a framework is also a con. So it's like every time you talk about work roles, I want to say, yeah, it's great to categorize by work roles. It's
Yeah.
also a con,
Yeah.
because
yeah,
it tries to standardize work roles. And as we know, working with customers and clients, like outside of a few exceptional work roles, it's it's a Frankenstein of skills for that organization to be whatever engineer. Uh,
Mhm.
there it's different. It's not a cookie cutter. What an identity access manager
Yeah.
looks like for one company, it might look a little bit different for another company.
when it's
Yeah.
also it's so variable, right? Like
Yeah.
with a lot of these, and or not necessarily variable, but a lot of these jobs are incredibly specialized, right? And so you could say, hey, I'm hiring a cybersecurity analyst, but does that mean like SOC analyst, a threat analyst, like kind of go more into those sort of things. It's like, I don't want to hire a cardiologist to be doing brain surgery or something like
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
As you get more and more experience, you start to really go into really hard into one particular thing, unless you're going on the more managerial sort of generalist route, right? And so I don't know,
It gets
it's
hard.
all planned. Yeah.
Yeah, I think trying to find that balance, and I think it's you want to be general enough that it applies to various organizations across different industries and sectors, but then you want to be specific enough because there are differences when it comes to a cybersecurity engineer working in one functional area versus another, or that specific company and what industry that they are. And I think that's what makes cybersecurity so challenging, is that because it does go across so many industry sectors, that it's not just kind of one particular area. But yeah, finding that right balance is hard, and I think that's why we try and look at all of these different frameworks. And you kind of want to cherry pick, but obviously you can't. And I think to your point earlier, Jeff, like, I think for organizations, once you start trying to implement a particular framework and try and be aligned to that on how you maybe write your job descriptions to it, or that's where you're using to track the skills that you're going to be measuring for, training purposes and things like that. It's hard because once you start actually implementing that, which can be a beast to do that, and to, get everybody up to speed and actually start, putting it towards your workforce development practices, then things update and then things change. And then it's like, but that's the industry. I mean, cybersecurity is always changing. So it's very hard. And I can understand why a lot of companies find it difficult to implement a lot of these frameworks. But at the end of the day, I do think that they are really good guides. But I think it's a guide. It's not prescriptive.
That's exactly the point. I think, like, as users of a framework, what they really want is an easy button,
Yeah.
to take something and just apply it, and it is done. And
Yeah.
it's a I don't call it a band-aid. But it's a ready to go band-aid, and it's fixed the issue. But that's not the case. Like any framework, right?
Yeah.
Even the NIST CSF, or ISO 27001. If you're looking at cybersecurity frameworks, there are guidelines with controls in place that you need to take that framework and apply it to your specific organization to see how you need to maybe tweak components of it as necessary to make it align well with the business. And that's the case with frameworks, right? Like, NICE will tell you, or SFIA will tell you, based on this title or work role, here's competencies or skills that matter. But when you take that profile and apply it to your specific organization, it might not look right. You might have to, you will have to make some adjustments, because it's not going to just be magically that thing that you just pulled off the shelf. So that's
also,
where the work plays.
Jeff, I don't know. You sound a little staticky.
Am I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's the coffee.
I've tried unplugging and replugging it in, so.
Okay. Yeah. I'll work on that while you guys continue the conversation.
Okay.
Oh yeah. No. It happens. Gotta love it.
But no, I think to that point, I mean, and like you said it earlier, what seems like a pro for one of these frameworks, or many of them, ends up being a con, because I think the good about these frameworks. Oh, I think we're having some sound issues. Okay.
We're good.
The good about some of these frameworks, we'll figure it out. That's live TV for you folks.
Oh,
but they do serve as, providing structure and standardization, whether they do it by the work roles or these categories or these functional areas, however they decide to organize the frameworks, it does provide that structure and kind of to make things a little bit more streamlined. And I think with that, it can really help, especially when you are trying to communicate from cybersecurity leadership, and having these conversations with human resources or learning and development, with these different departments or teams that aren't cyber specific. And so when you're trying to tell them that we need these specifics, very technical cyber skills, they're like, I don't know what that means. But so having this framework can kind of serve as that, just common lexicon, or just like a way to kind of speak to each other when you're not speaking the same language, which I do think can be helpful, and again serve as a guide for, okay, now that we are kind of speaking the same language, again, when you are talking to like HR, learning and development, you can use it. Okay, this framework says that these are the specific skills or competencies that this particular work role that I've aligned to, this work role on my team, are needed. And then you can use that for benchmarking and compliance and mapping training and certifications. And again, it kind of just serves as a way to kind of, like, if your SOC analyst is like, oh, I want this, Sec Plus certification, and it just kind of gives you a little bit of like evidence to go to HR, learning and development, and see like, hey, well, actually the NICE framework says that this is an appropriate, certification for this particular job role. Let's move forward with getting this person the certificate. Like, that's just a kind of a very, basic example, but it can kind of be that of like a little bit of evidence, kind of holding a little bit of weight to like, okay, like, let's align these things and let's find some way to have that.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, one, do I sound any better?
Oh, you sound great now. Yeah.
Just like, welcome to our team meeting, because usually it's Sasha with the technical bug.
Yeah.
I must have caught it from you. So we mentioned a couple of the good things, right? So it is a way to structure. It is a useful frameworking tool to kind of apply to an enterprise that's work setting. There are, I'll kind of recap and bow ties here a little bit. Each framework has specific skills or competencies or tasks, depending on the framework, of how those skills, tasks, competencies, knowledge areas, etc., align back to a work role. So those are all like really great, useful things. To your point, last point, Sasha, you can use that to kind of help justify initiatives at an organization, whether it's a training initiative or spend on certifications, whether that's for compliance or just it's relevant to the work role. Those are good uses for those tools. While we're on the good topic, why don't we kind of highlight a little bit of some of the things that we really like about specific frameworks? Like I like, I'll start with NICE. I like that NICE has a very robust, at least they've cut it down over the years, but they do have a lot of knowledge and skill areas and tasks. So if you're looking for granularity, you can have a lot of granularity with the NICE framework. And they've created some builder tools too, so you can kind of create your own work role with certain
or job description.
and job descriptions, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I really like about NICE. I'll turn it over to you, Sasha, to cherry pick something.
Yeah,
About any of them.
yeah, for me, and we touched on it a little bit, but SFIA, I think, makes it unique in the sense that it does break down the levels of responsibility, really based off of taking that in consideration that depending on somebody's job level, their seniority level, they're going to have a different level of responsibility. And so if they're more kind of going towards the management track, they're going to have more of those kind of people skills, soft skills, and management skills, but their level of doing things more independently on the technical side of things too, as it goes up in seniority level, is going to change versus somebody at the more junior level. And I do feel like that is what makes it unique, where a lot of the other frameworks don't necessarily take that into account, like you kind of mentioned earlier, Will.
Yeah, there's a lot of like actual qualitative differences in a lot of those levelings or the difficulties, right? So what I do like about SFIA as well is that it is a little bit more broad in terms of, because it is more just overall technology based, which especially in smaller organizations, you're going to get a lot of people who need to dip their toes into various, areas. Maybe they're not as specialized. Just again, like, if you have a cyber workforce of about 10 people, then all of a sudden you guys are going to have to kind of cover each other or at least help each other out in some kind of way. And so there's going to be that, peripheral knowledge that you'll need. And I think that makes, like SFIA kind of helps with that. One of the things that I think, when we were talking about the benefits of just frameworks in general, is that they could also serve as kind of a pop-up tent in a way of qualifying workforce, right? I always say that, I always think that you should just kind of go and see, as we were saying, cherry pick the stuff you like the best. But they do provide a good basis. When it comes to like NICE and things like that, I do find, that, and even as we get into some of the more like work role centric ones, they're pretty good for that kind of, setting up, if you have very standardized language and stuff like that, right? Just try and, match them one for one if you want to, and then just fill in with base, nuance afterwards, right? But so that's kind of something that I find very interesting with SFIA, is that it can really help if there are people who are going into a lot of different things. They're not even, they're talking about like straight data science. There's a whole lot of stuff for data science which isn't present in other frameworks, because I believe like NICE kind of is adjacent to some of that stuff, right? They would have it in like their competency groupings and stuff like that, but nothing, not a focus on it, right?
DCWF,
just being
that differs a little bit. Like DCWF, the DoD's cyber workforce framework, is very similar to NICE. They used to be really, really similar. But I think one of the things that's differentiating DCWF right now is on that front, Will, is like they do they have more robust layouts from a work role perspective as it relates back to like data analytics, data engineering, and there are several data related or data science related work roles there. And I think that's a pro of theirs that kind of sets them apart from the other ones. But you have to take with it too, like you're going to have a lot of mission and effects kind of work roles that you would have with cyber operators who have authorities that are only exist in the government realm or DoD realm. So that's kind of the balance again we're talking about, like what which ones do you want to use for what purposes?
And
well, they also sorry. No, go ahead.
I know, I was just gonna piggyback off that a little bit, and I think with that is that like some of them include things that others don't, and I think it can be seen as a pro when it is included, but then it can also be seen as a pro when it's not included. Like I feel like NICE is a little bit more aligned with the certifications for the work role, where I feel like DCWF has a little bit, but like SFIA, for example, is not certification focused. And I think that varies by company. You have a lot of companies that really value certifications, and that's how they offer training and development to their employees. And then you have others that don't really care about certification. So I think it depends on what your interests and your priorities are, that you can see it being included or it not being included as a pro either way.
Yeah, and there's this big kind of it seems like a lot of them are kind of siloed into two different tribes in a way, where you have one being very skills focused while another one being very work roles focused. And I think both of them do have benefits to each, right? Again, like
Sure.
I would say that work roles, right? If you have a, codified standard of work roles, there's probably a better way of gauging baselines and stuff like that, right? How much does your particular workforce deviate or are, kind of converge skills wise against the broader industry, right? But at the same time, when we have a more skills based approach, that can be very much like I feel like you would get a lot more nuance out of that, right? Because again, the work roles and stuff like that are not as what's the word, boxed in, I guess, right? And so, when we look at all of these in kind of, the meta here, it's like that's kind of those two different camps.
Sure.
And again, when we talk about like the pop-up tent solution, I would kind of liken that to the kind of more work roles centric stuff, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but
And
I think
I think we didn't intend. It's not in the show notes to talk about the balance of these, but I'm glad you brought it up, Will, and we've been talking about it because I think one of the big balances is simplicity, right? Like for users of the framework, you want something simple to apply to your workforce, but you're going to have more nuance and I would say accuracy with something that's more complex. So like when we're looking at workforce and we're talking about the taxonomies that we use or adapt and modify, you guys know this well, like in our meetings, I want to pull us more towards complex, like let's get as granular as we can. So I have to also kind of take my foot off the pedal sometimes, like going too complex, because we don't want to make it overly complex when we take it towards and use and apply it for a customer. But when we're actually analyzing one role to another role or one level to another level, it's really hard to have something that is overly simplistic, like something like the European cyber skills framework. They are very simplistic, which is great for users. It's like it's these handful of competencies or skills that are most meaningful for work roles. And when you're only looking at 6 to 12 skills for a work role, there's a lot of stuff missing from that skill profile for that role if you don't have the complexity or granularity. So it is really tricky. Sasha, we were jumping in at the same time, so I'll let you take it.
No, you brought up the point I was going to make. Actually, I was going to mention like the European one, the EU one only focuses on those 12 work roles, and so basically just what you said, that it has its pros and its cons, because I think, like you said, it could be missing things, but then sometimes it's nice because it's just 12 work roles. They have it really kind of cleaned up really nice when it comes to education and like the skills and things like that are related specifically to those work roles. And that kind of gives you a shortened list to focus on. And sometimes that's a nice, easy button. But I think to your point, it can be missing out on a lot of, other key factors and stuff. So it's, again, that balance of getting too general versus getting too specific. It's how do you find something in that sweet spot in the middle?
Well, yeah. And I think at least on my side, I can get as complex as I want with it, which is really nice. I can kind of cheat on it. Because and when we talk about, because a lot of them will boil down into those more nuanced sort of deals, which is great. Especially, but say, because I've been looking at things like the people analytics maturity model, which I believe was made by Burson by Deloitte. Basically, there's a guy, Josh Burson, really big people analytics mind in that space, and essentially kind of breaks down, there's 4 different levels to this analytics maturity model, and most people are stuck at the first one, which is essentially just taking the data they already have and then reporting on it, right? Or trying to extrapolate skills and things like that, right? Finding trends from the past. And I think that's where those less complex ones would be most useful, right? So again, those work roles that are already set out or something like that. But at least for us, because this is like the meat and potatoes of what we do, we have the freedom to kind of examine it on a nuanced or very complex way. And not only that, but I think it's just important to have, even if it is complex and nuanced, for it to eventually be boiled down very simple just across the board. Because how are you going to convince, board members or the people that you need to, secure finances and, budgets from, how are you going to convince them on particular things? You're not going to give them a, 100-line lawn histogram or something, right? And expect them to kind of be like, oh, okay, like it's those kind of things of, it always should boil down to simplicity, especially when you're talking about those, talking to those key stakeholders and stuff. Which is, yeah. So but that's why I can kind of get away with a lot of it. So even like the stuff about things I learned and, kind of boils down into, well, we can have certification centric, frameworks and stuff and have them aligned with certifications, but certifications in a way decay in their relevancy and their importance over time, right? That's why they always have to keep refreshing them. So it's stuff like that. So when you're gauging performance and things like that, that's another thing you have to keep in mind is the timeliness element of these, right? And sometimes with the frameworks that keep refreshing, there is a lot of catch up you have to play in that regard. So again, a lot of these factors, and I know I'm getting really into the weeds here, but again, I'm allowed to do that. So, but those are a lot of things that, people have to weigh when they're going into this, like that's what I would say, at least.
Yeah.
So
we talked about the good and on the context of balance. We've simultaneously talked about some, cons. We didn't really talk about the uglies. So I just want to kind of give the floor. Are there, not to call anything out specifically, just with regard to frameworks at large, what is your one or two, this is ugly?
Yeah, I think, just kind of to Will's point that he was kind of making, that sometimes it doesn't actually, these frameworks don't actually become a workforce, doesn't measure like workforce maturity. They tend to kind of be compliance check blocks and like, okay, do we have this? Do we have this? Do we have that? And so I think that can cause just a lot of confusion or just not really serving the true purpose or making it as useful or as impactful as it could be, because some of those key elements are missing. So that's just one thing.
Yeah. Will?
Yeah, I'd say that. And I'd say sometimes it's just the amount of frameworks that are out there, right?
Yeah.
Because of the amount of frameworks that are out there, it muddies the water and it gets really difficult to establish a baseline language for a lot of stuff, right? So there was this, and I'm forgetting the acronym. I think it's like MDMS or something, but basically, and I talked to you guys about this separately at one time, but it was essentially the kind of world of medicine. They made a huge dictionary breaking down even just the smallest phrases and things like that, so that whenever you slot in a particular framework or a particular compliance language or something like that, you could essentially break up that language and find similarities if you're trying to gauge particular things or compare training or something like that. And I mean, I'm glad they're thorough because it's very that's all the good medical stuff. Like we need all of them to speak the same language, but why can't we do that here? And it really muddies the water. More and more frameworks come into this. I think a lot of the frameworks, or all of the frameworks, are good. They have their pros, but that's kind of the big thing. And so on the back end, at least, like one of the big things is really doing the semantic alignment, right? You could do something as simple as like a cosine similarity, right? Where again, we're breaking all these words and stuff down into numbers and probabilistic distributions. But you could do something like that. You could use LLMs to compare it. You guys know my opinions on some of the rampant LLM usage that happens. But yeah, so while that is maybe a gripe that has been lessened, especially now that text analysis at scale has gotten or has improved, especially over the past 5 years, it's still a big thing. And not only that, but then it is the translation to, HR or people who might not be familiar with the terminology or whatever, right? How many cybersecurity analyst positions have you seen on LinkedIn or Indeed, right? they start to overgeneralize. And so I think that's a big thing as well.
Yeah.
That's a good segue into the next section. I'll add my ugly, and then, you know, 'cause it fits in with that, but you already started to talk about, you know, managing a Rosetta Stone. So that's kind of our next block here. But I would say the ugly part for frameworks, from my perspective, is they do need to be updated. So once you start getting your hands around one, and then it's going to go through another update, and you're going to have to figure out what changed, what's different, and how do I reapply that back to the workforce you're managing. And I think that's particularly not helpful. And I'll comment on your point, Will, about that there are so many. And I think that's a challenge for HR folks, right? And HR ISs, like systems like a Workday or a Rippling or something that's actually managing the people side from a software perspective on your enterprise, is that I think there's a desire to have everybody in the organization, no matter what department you fall under, finance or cyber or operations, et cetera, to kind of have that same set standard skills Rubicon or taxonomy. But, you know, cyber is very different. And quite frankly, a lot of the other professions are very different from each other too. So, it's, you know, there's this need to kind of say, here's how I categorize everybody in my organization, while also, you know, a necessary nuance around the specific skill sets related to each profession in their own right, which is a good kind of jump into this, you know, second block of, you know, how do we manage a Rosetta Stone of frameworks? This is, you brought that study up, the medical dictionary, Will, and I was like, yep, that's exactly what we need to do. So get on it, Will, right? Like, let's do a knowledge graph, or, you know, let's figure out how all these things can talk to each other, and like define the actual framework or skills taxonomy that we want to use at SkillRex, and then be able to translate across all of the frameworks as well. So, you know, I'll give you back the floor for a moment, Will, just to kind of take us dive us a little deeper into this idea of languages talking other languages, and instantaneous translations, essentially.
Yeah, and so part of me is like, how deep do we want to go into it? Because we could get into some really complicated math and stuff. 10 minutes deep. But essentially, so again, we're talking about, there's been great strides in semantic analysis, right? And primarily that's to do with, you know, machine learning and LLMs, which is great. You know, I would say, you know, if you're going to use it, use a local LLM. Don't, you know, don't do API calls to something else, because it could get really weird, really fast. But I would say that when we're establishing a taxonomy or a Rosetta Stone, I would say that's one of the big things first, is trying to find the similarities in languages, right? Whether it is the, you know, particular domain, right? If there is stuff in incident response, then automatically let's try and line those up. But I would say there usually should be some kind of standardized at scale solution that is more in line with, you know, like making a code stack or something, to at least kind of break through at least the beginning stages. Because again, a lot of people try to take a very, I would say, human-based approach to it, which is really necessary, but at the same time, it could get really difficult really fast, just managing all that. And so I'd say, like, yeah. And then at that point, you start to just go in whatever technique or direction you want to go into, right? Cosine similarity, you know, Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is I'm a big fan of that. It probably doesn't mean anything to anybody here, but, or even, you know, establishing some kind of RAG system, which is retrieval augmented generation, where essentially we are taking vast swaths of these frameworks and ingesting them, and then having an LLM, you know, after that essentially process those, right? It's, you know, by itself. All of this, of course, hopefully being siloed in your own local environment. But that's very like the technical stuff that I'm sort of thinking about. But I guess, where would you want me to point to in terms of like, is there anything in terms of like approach? Because again, that's just off the top where I'd be like, this is how I'd start, you know, creating a similarity. But then, you know, I guess, is there anything else?
I think that's a good set the stage, right? Like, you've given everybody the opportunity to see how deep the pool is. So then we're looking at the pool, and it's like, oh, poop, it's really deep.
Yeah, I mean, like, if any of this is like, you know, tough, but you want to know about it, like, just chat GPT it or something, right? Like just,
Yeah.
the internet's, out there, and it's very helpful. So
I think take a look at the shallow end though, and I'll go to, Sasha and I can kind of add some context to it. Like, Sasha, we've been doing some work on, looking across all the frameworks and the skill taxonomies or competency taxonomies, to kind of say what's the best approach for this. So I'll just kind of hand it over to you for just a moment to kind of talk about either the challenges that we've had or the revelations that we've had, when looking across, all these various cyber workforce frameworks to kind of really make sense of them, in a way that creates that translation guide.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, when doing that, trying to understand one, how each of them is structured and how they're organized, whether it be by work role, by functional area, by knowledge, task, and abilities, by skills, and then understanding the differences between skills and competencies. I think it's just one, making sure you have a general understanding of the variety within them. And then I think to Will's point is finding what those similarities are, I think is really important. And then thinking about the pros and cons that we mentioned, finding, okay, what do I like about this one? What do I like about that one? And I think trying to figure out, okay, like what is an ideal state, or what are the things that are, how are we making sense of all of this, and what are we kind of going to be using it for? I think that kind of is all the things that we are trying to take in consideration when comparing and contrasting all of them, and then thinking about how we can kind of create a Rosetta Stone, being able to figure out what is not only, similar, but what those differences are as well, I think is really important, so that way we can, speak to one another. Because I think that's at the end of the day what it is that it's really trying to describe those overlapping concepts, with those different structures and naming conventions and all those levels of detail. And I think, one thing that, we specifically are really trying to implement are taking consideration to proficiency levels. And we've kind of talked about that a little bit, that some frameworks do include them, most of them don't. But really trying to understand how these frameworks demonstrate a skill or a competency. NICE is really kind of just perform or don't perform. SFIA, we said, talks about those explicit levels of responsibility, and you can kind of associate that with proficiency, because it has those different levels of apply, enable, advise, initiate. And then even organizations, sometimes at the internal level, they have their own internal scales of, a beginner versus an intermediate versus a senior versus a principal. Like, what does it mean for their career progression plans? And what makes a junior analyst different from a principal analyst? Is it just literally the years that they of experience that they have? Is it specific knowledge and proficiency? Is it the amount of certifications or experience that they've had and done, and things that they can actually put down on a list? So it's a lot of different factors, but at the end of the day, I think we're trying to just get some clarity on what these different job roles are and what the industry expects from them, what the framework expects from them, what the company expects from them. And it's definitely challenging to kind of put all of that together, and then trying to align training with that, and workforce planning when it comes to hiring people, and growing those people and going from one job role to another. It's a lot of work. That's definitely what we do and what we specialize in. And so I think that we've found a way to do it, but it definitely, it gets difficult. So
Yeah, I think that there's like some core components, like in any of the frameworks, that kind of bind them together. It's either like and we've mentioned them already, like work role or a specific skill / competency. And there is a difference between skills and competencies.
Yeah,
we interchange them. I interchange the use of those words all the time, but competency is essentially like a grouping of skills and tasks together, whereas a skill is something more discrete. And so there are these, like, the work role, the competency, and like these skills that kind of are the common denominators across all the frameworks. But where we start to get things a little bit on the periphery that really influence how effective or useful the framework can be, or how complex it can turn into really quickly, is like a categorization system, right?
Yeah.
We mentioned functional grouping. We like kind of functionally looking at different work roles. The categorization of skills or competencies, right? Are they technical? Are they power skills or leadership skills, organizational skills? So that's another bucketing system that you can kind of look at. And then one of the other things that I think is always throwing a wrench in my mind is product side. Like there's this blending and you know, mixturing of skill sets that kind of happen when you actually have competencies and skills and work roles with products people use, right? Like, does a product become a skill to use that specific product, or is it just a tool of a skill? And it's probably the latter, but organizations can have teams that are very specific to a product suite and skills very specific to that product solution. So all those things kind of like muddy up the water a little bit in a way that, requires anybody who's managing a workforce to have a need to make sense of it. And I think that's kind of where it comes in handy for our team, is like, we'll make sense of this. We're seeing 5 skills that are related to communications. Can we just call it communication, or do we need to break it into like 5 different types of verbal or written? And
communication versus written communication versus presentation, right? It's and I think a lot of it, because it's very much okay if you wanted to make your own, really just, I would say, pick one of the frameworks that you agree with the language most in, and then adopt whatever approach other ones have that fits best towards, because again, the taxonomy and stuff starts to kind of get removed after a while. If you start to, again, you have to decide on one language to speak, and then essentially see, okay, now do we want to silo these in work roles? Do we want to silo these in particular domains, and stuff like that? And it really, I feel like eventually it starts to become that meta conversation of, we're just going to quickly adopt, whatever, right? Because again, in the context of our Rosetta Stone discussion here, we're talking mostly about, what would work for a particular business, not for all businesses in establishing, this new world order baseline, right? Or something like that. And I think that's a big thing is, find which one you agree with the most in terms of terminology and stuff like that. Like if you want to use even an old, framework or something like that, it's totally fine. And then just adapt it in whatever way. Because even now, like there's, as we've already talked about, there's always going to be pros, there's always going to be cons. And I think that's a big thing, because we're even seeing, we've been in a big conversation about how do we track emerging stuff, right? So again, AI's been here. It's going to continue to be here, and everybody is investing heavily into it to keep up. And what is that going to do, right? Is that going to be, are we going to have AI authoring, people being hired, right? Is it going to be people specifically working on agentic AI, right? It's those kind of deals. And, how do you break that down, right? And so I think it's all about just adopting a taxonomy and then maybe cross-referencing it with other ones in terms of approach. And you kind of make your own little gestalt sort of deal, right? All of it kind of coming together in a hive mind. But yeah.
All right. Well, I said 10 minutes. We went about 12 on the deep dive. Let's go to our last segment here with This Week I Learned. I'm going to start with you, Sasha, and we'll go to Will.
Yeah. So I think something that I've always known, but I think it kind of got reiterated this week, just the importance of data visualization. And I think just how when you're looking at data, you're looking at these numbers in whatever format it may be, whether it's a spreadsheet or, what have you. But there is so much power in being able to visualize that data. And obviously there's so many different ways that you can do that with, all these different graphs and all these systems and software and all these things that are way too technologically advanced for me. But I think even just the simplest thing of when you have numbers across, different cells on a spreadsheet and then putting that into a visualization. And I'm thinking just about call that we had, and how when you're looking at the numbers across cells, it's so different when you actually see it visualized. And when you do, and how that is able to really kind of paint a picture for you, and seeing whether, again, whatever chart visualization that you use, it doesn't really matter, but just being able to see that was just something that kind of happened, and with the client, and that kind of just was just like, yeah, like this is why it's so powerful to be able to visualize data, because when you're looking at it in a spreadsheet, it doesn't look that crazy or anything like that, but when you're seeing it there, it just makes a difference. So that was something that just popped up, to me, and just reminded me the importance of that. And I think it also is just what I always go back to, what I really enjoy about the work that we do, is because we do really let the data inform things and decisions, or give us context on, what we're doing, but being able to have that power of visualizing it. And a lot of that is our great Will here, who's our data wizard, be able to put that all together. But it really just makes a difference. And I just, yeah.
Great point.
Yeah.
Will, over to you. What
Well,
did you learn this week?
Oh, well, so there's quite a few things. I kind of got into a little bit of a rabbit hole.
Well, you did go to the
Again,
bookstore, so
Yeah.
oh yeah. No, I did buy several books this week, which was very nice. But this is a little different. I was in an internet rabbit hole, kind of looking at the utilization of people analytics in HRM systems and stuff, and we're still seeing that for the most part, we're not seeing organizations using it to its full potential. We're seeing that, at least over half are actually, using people analytics and stuff for things like recruitment and then also retention. However, that starts to kind of meter off the more and more we get into things like engagement and, benefits and compensation, stuff like that, upskilling. And I think a lot of that is incredibly important to kind of keep note of and track, especially as we're kind of in this, great stay era right now. Part of me is like, are we going to get something where once, if job market stresses start to relieve themselves, then all of a sudden we're going to see a bunch of people, running for the hills or something like that. Right. And is that something that, like, as, people managers, is that something they have to keep in mind? But it started to lead me into some stuff, especially in the cybersecurity cybersecurity workforce sort of joint stuff. And there was this one study that came out last year that I found incredibly interesting, because essentially they were asking people and conducting studies to essentially be like, hey, what are the best ways to visualize, knowledge profiling, right? Which is kind of something we're doing here, right? And something that Sasha just, touched on here, where it's like they were finding things like, oh, histograms are really good for senior managers, right? Usually histograms of skills in particular are good for senior managers, while, say, a spider chart, which I don't know if you guys know, like, kind of, how those look. They're really cool. I like them. Those are actually really good for if you're talking to more executive or board member type people, right? So stuff like that. But I think they brought up a really good approach when it came to, because again, we were talking about relevancy and stuff. And they essentially broke down skills into 4 different aspects, right? This was a study done by the University of Bristol, and they essentially tried to, I think it was the CyberBOK framework they were kind of falling in line with, which is a cyber framework made in the UK. But essentially, there was certification, like, again, of the skills and stuff. There was certification, there was skills extracted from training, whether it's on the job or somewhere else. I believe I have my notes here too. Yeah. And then what was it? Knowledge learned through experience, right? So cyber roles across their career. And then finally, knowledge in that has been extracted via responsibility in their current job, right? And they basically said everything from certification to training to experience are ones that are subject to decay over time, right? When we talk about how that kind of factors into skills, that, or like grading skills, I guess, is that, okay, certifications are really good once you have them, but then it's going to slowly decay over time in terms of how, how good of a judge it really is, because,
Sure.
accounting for the technological changes and increases or whatever, right?
Booty changes.
But responsibility always stays the same because it's your current role, right?
Yeah.
And so it was stuff like that where I was like, oh, okay, like that's pretty neat. And so at least for me, as I could get as complicated as I want to, whenever we're going and assessing workforces or something, that's a factor that can be put into the mix too, right? And so stuff like that, I'm like, oh, okay, okay.
Pretty cool.
But yeah, anyways.
I'll keep mine short because we're getting close on time here. But for me, it was over the last week, New York Times had an article it was titled the newest face of unemployment, the college educated. And that was kind of, I don't want to say the thing I learned, but I was maybe surprised at how much unemployment has skyrocketed for college educated people, particularly when they're looking at this article. They were talking about long-term unemployment, so anything being unemployed for over 6 months, and that from that perspective, I'll show this little graph here. You can see here, and for people who are just listening, that the college graduates have exponentially increased on unemployment rates over the last 10 years. And right now they're essentially like the highest as far as long-term unemployment, one of the highest groupings of people. So which is, this article really kind of resonated with me because, as I'm looking across LinkedIn and a lot of friends and colleagues and peers, especially in this space, who have had reductions in workforce, open to work badges, et cetera, and knowing kind of how long it does take to find a job. This was actually a little bit not surprising, but definitely surprising in the sense of like, I didn't know it was this bad. While unemployment rates are still relatively low, just over 4%, it's getting a little worse, but it's still within acceptable ranges. This is a particular stat that has a lot of people worried about the long-term unemployment of this group of people. So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on and talk a little bit more about, hopefully on future episodes. And actually, it's probably a good segue into kind of closing out our show today, because next time we're going to, I think, lift the hood on that a little bit. I'd love to have the next time we come on the show for episode 3, talk about the workforce gap, if that still exists, what does the future of cyber skills look like? And to do that, I believe we're going to have Will Markow, CEO of 41 Insights, on our show. So you won't want to miss that if you're regularly listening to us. So with that, I'll just kind of close out by thanking everyone today for taking the time to join us on our show. Thanking you, Sasha, Will, for joining, and to just kind of call to action to follow us on LinkedIn, and follow SkillRex on LinkedIn as well if you have the time. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel where we're posting this. And until next time, I hope you all have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.